Afghanistan. The men's team was supposed to be coming to Hobart to play a test match, something we talked about a lot, something we were looking forward to a lot, seeing that first step of having the first test match they would have played in Australia, the first sort of bilateral match they would have played in Australia, having been there for the 2015 World Cup, but that was the only visit from an Afghanistan team so far. Obviously, the country's been overrun by the Taliban in the last couple of months. It's happened extremely quickly, extremely abruptly, and it's prompted a rethink from the Australian end about how things should proceed. This is something that brings in government, it brings in administration with Cricket Australia. There's the Tasmanian government's involvement, the federal government's involvement. The Tassie government sort of kicked it off by saying that they wanted to consult the local Hazara community in Hobart about whether it would be appropriate to go ahead with the test match. The federal government was a little more quiet on it, although eventually, once the story became a story, Richard Colbeck was drawn out on SEN to say that we've made a clear statement that we don't support excluding women from sport at any level. And it was kind of left up to Cricket Australia largely to make a call on it. Now, they've done this in a vague sort of sense. They haven't expressly cancelled the game yet. They've phrased things in the subjunctive to say that if recent media reports that women's cricket will not be supported in Afghanistan are substantiated, Cricket Australia would have no alternative but to not host Afghanistan for the proposed test. It's blameless sort of language, but we know where they're going with it. Basically, the situation is not going to change in Afghanistan. The Taliban are not going to suddenly say, oh yeah, we love supporting women in all their endeavours, and think that they should be allowed to do what they want. And so effectively, the match is off.
Yeah, look, when we left this a couple of weeks ago with Shadi Khan Saif, when we had him on the show to talk about cricket in Afghanistan following the Taliban reclaiming the country, the sense we got through that chat was that cricket would be on surer footing this time than in the Taliban's previous reign, on the basis that there'd been such a groundswell of support among local Afghan people for it. Many consider it the national sport. The amazing story of the men's team especially, and indeed even the fact that there had been steps made to have a system in place where women could be playing there sooner rather than later. There'd been these contracts handed out last year and so on. However, almost at the first time of asking, really, the Taliban have told on themselves when this question was put by SBS, and the spokesperson went on to articulate a position which is thoroughly abhorrent. And maybe one we should have always anticipated. Maybe we should have always saw this coming to a head the moment that the Taliban were back in Kabul a couple of weeks ago, that it was unsustainable to imagine a world where the ICC could have Afghanistan as a member nation when they had such strident views about not only women playing, but ridiculous stuff about, they might be subjected to cameras taking photos of them, and, language that doesn't fit anywhere in the modern world, full stop. It doesn't. Remember, the Taliban doesn't reflect the people of Afghanistan. It reflects a segment, a militaristic segment, who sort of are set in the dark ages, really, in terms of the way they see the world. So this isn't about religion. It's about a group of people who have a thirst for power, megalomania. And here we are, where the ICC have a constitution that expressly forbids excluding women. The men, again, great story, one of the greatest stories in world cricket over the last 20 years, yet they are in the firing line. This series, if it doesn't go ahead, and it won't, there's no way they're playing this test match now. Richard Colbeck, a friend of mine, a man of principle. You may not expect me to say that about a member of this current government, but he genuinely is a man of principle and a cricket lover, a sport lover, a proud Tasmanian. That would have been a tough thing for him to have gone out and said, and supporting the test not going ahead there at Bellerive Oval. Same applies for Cricket Australia, who, as we know, Jeff, stand to lose quite a lot of money due to their settlement with Channel 7. And I'm sure they'll find a way through that, by the way. I don't expect that 7 would be unreasonable about these circumstances. But they're going to have to find an accommodation there, which they otherwise wouldn't have had to if this test went ahead. So all told, I found this quite a difficult issue to grapple with in the last week, because part of me instinctively feels as though, and Izzy Westbury articulated this position well, that the only way you can approach this is with a hardline position and to hit them where it hurts most, in power, and in this case the men's team. But I also have felt challenged by the alternative view that why would you punish the part of the cricket landscape over there, which has been such a source for good, and there's this ongoing push,
and which is one of the few good news stories to come out of a country that's done it
precisely
so horrendously tough, not just for the last 20 years since the Americans went in, but for the 20 years before that when the Russians went in, when the Mujahideen warlords were tearing the place apart between themselves, a place where violence and strife has been literally part of daily life for the best part of half a century.
Well, and longer. You can go back to the middle of the 19th century when this all started, right? I mean, the push-pull with Afghanistan, I feel desperately for the people there who've had the chance to, have a different kind of existence for 20 years, and here we are. And, I'm probably going to say what you're about to say, but the cricket team, the men's cricket team, and, the positive energy around getting women playing the game, I mean, the rug's been pulled from underneath both opportunities there. It's just a desperate situation.
Yeah. So what I thought we'd do here is, because I don't think either of us come into this like we come into some topics thinking, I've got a great solution, here's what my opinion is. Yeah. Like you, I don't really know what my opinion is, and my opinion doesn't really matter. But I don't think there is an obvious better answer in this case. So I thought what we might try to do is assess the arguments and at least try to help people work through, think through it as we've been trying to think through it while preparing for this show. So the argument against hosting Afghanistan is pretty simple, that you've got a dictatorial religious regime who've taken over the country violently and who've always been violent and have used violence through their entire existence to try to push a hardline religious view. If they claim to be running the country and you host a team representing that country, then you're in effect endorsing that regime. You're supporting that regime, and you're supporting what they purport to be their aims, or not what they purport, what actually are their aims, which is that women shouldn't be involved in anything. The previous iterations of the Taliban were getting to the point where they were making people paint over the windows of their houses so that people couldn't look in and possibly see a woman inside wearing a burqa. This is the kind of level of insanity that they've got about this idea that women will be perceived outside the family. It goes to that level of extremity. And so in a sport that has been very transparently and obviously and enthusiastically trying to promote the women's side of the game, at least for the last few years, even though it took a long time to get there, it's completely anathema to support as a full member a country that won't let them participate, right? And so when you look at it like that, it seems pretty black and white.
It does look black and white when it couldn't be anything close to black and white, right? I mean, if we took a moral stance on who we, and I say we in a very general sense here, but let's say we as Australians, based on the politics of the countries sitting on the other side of the net, there'd be a lot of countries that Australia wouldn't engage with. And there'd Afghanistan...
countries who wouldn't want to engage with Australia, and fairly so.
Well... Perhaps so. I mean, I haven't really thought of the other side of it. But certainly you could mount an argument for a number of countries that will fall into that boat. Yet we've got strong trade relationships with them, and therefore that would never happen. Strong diplomatic ties as well. It's very different in Afghanistan. They don't have a lot to offer Australia. So, and also they're not considered a strong cricketing nation. If they had the strength of a team that was in the top 4 or 5 teams in the world or something like that, which isn't to say they won't be there, by the way, in a generation or two, certainly in the shortest form of the game. That's the way their trend line's going, considering they were only admitted to the ICC in whatever it was, 2002 or something like that, to where they are now. As I say, it's a staggering story to think they're in the World Cup ahead of Bangladesh this year, next month. They're in that World Cup. Bangladesh are not in that World Cup. They're in the qualifier tournament trying to get into the World Cup beforehand. So that's where it's not black and white, because if it were, this isn't, in other words, South Africa apartheid, right? So that South Africa apartheid was a situation where a number of countries, the Commonwealth, said no, we're not playing ball, and for 21 years there was an exclusionary policy around South Africa and sport through that apartheid regime. That was a decision that was able to be taken because the South African government were part of the club before. Afghanistan aren't part of any club. I mean, they're part of the ICC, but this is such a modern thing that they've been involved in with cricket. It's not like they go back a century or more, like a lot of the cricketing nations that Australia are usually playing against. So it's easy to write it off as well. They're just some small nation. It doesn't mean anything anyway, and we'll get on with life.
Well, yeah, I suppose there is that. There's the comparative lack of clout. But it also, I mean, the South Africa comparison is an interesting one. I think I'll come back to that in a little bit. But in terms of weighing up that argument against continuing to engage with them, just cutting them off completely because of their reprehensible government that's taken over, and I mean, it feels ridiculous to even call it a government. It's a hostile military takeover of the entire country under extreme duress and under the intense threat of violence that was cultivated through the previous regime and through their time out of power, where they continued blowing people up right, left and centre. The argument that you can make to say that this match should go ahead and that Afghanistan shouldn't be questioned as being part of future tournaments and so on. Hamid Shinwari, who's the CEO of the Afghanistan Cricket Board, put this together and posted up this statement. And he basically says he concedes that, that yes, this is completely anathema to the way that international cricket is going with wanting to have more women's participation. Right? But he also says try to understand the cultural context of the country that we live in, and that we've been trying to make this, have these meetings of modern and conventional ways of thinking in Afghanistan, that they have been working on developing women's players. They have been developing a women's team. They've been having to do it sort of softly because of the cultural environment that they're working in. So he explains the dramatic changes in governmentally in terms of regimes over the last 40 years. And the quote from him, that there's a couple of quotes I'd like to include from him. He says, this has included numerous changes in the governance of our country and approaches to both our traditional cultures and our Islamic faith. The whole country is in flux and transition with the new government as it sets its priorities and policies. The development of women's cricket has been slow in Afghanistan, just as it was for other more traditional cultures. And he references, quite rightly, I think, Pakistan, Bangladesh, places where even a generation or two ago, women's cricket was treated very hostilely, and in a lot of quarters still is. He says, nonetheless, there has been a quiet but significant development of women's cricket over the past 10 years. If CA decides to isolate the Afghan men's national team, it will have no impact upon those cultural and religious values as they stand, but the development of cricket in our country will be stalled. And this seems basically like the position that Gideon Haigh was putting on Offsiders on the ABC the other day. They're pretty much parallel.
Yeah, well, Gideon put a well-meaning but premature response, largely echoing what Hamid Shinwari said late last week. And I sort of appreciate that perspective. Certainly the bit about traditional cultures, using his words there, and citing Pakistan. I mean, we told that story before on The Final Word about Pakistan's first trip to overseas
in the 1990s.
In the late 1997. The story of the Khan sisters effectively being smuggled out of the country just to play amid death threats in newspaper editorials. So it's not without precedent that a country that has a very strong view about women's cricket can soften and evolve and now provide enormous support to women's cricket like Pakistan does now. They've got 3 tiers of professional contracts, and sure, it's not perfect, but it's emblem. Women's domestic cricket's on telly in Pakistan. I mean, there have been huge strides forward, even in the career of Sana Mir, and we've celebrated Sana Mir on this podcast before, but even in her 15 years as an international, so much has changed and so much will change again. So whether again, as Hamid Shinwari says, that all we are doing is stalling that progress, and for the men's team as well in the same decision, because presumably this will be a domino effect, right? Australia have made this call, again, using Gideon's words here, well-meaning call, which first blush looks like it might be against their financial interests. It certainly provides a problem for members of the board, incumbent members of the board, like Earl Eddings, for example, who is looking for support from Cricket Tasmania, according to well-sourced reports in the 9 papers earlier this year. So it hasn't been without some personal cost, them saying, no, we're going to pull the pin on this trip. But they've made the call on the basis that they can't look past this. Again, it's fraught, isn't it? Because I absolutely see that perspective, but I do think that there is going to be... The people who will lose out of this won't be the Taliban. It'll be the cricketers. And as a rule, I don't like outcomes that affect the people rather than those in power.
Yeah, I think one important distinction to make is what Hamid Shinwari is talking about the broader cultural situation. The idea that women shouldn't be playing sport, that's not just a Taliban thing. That's not purely a sort of extremist, reactionary kind of idea. Like, obviously there's a diversity and plurality of opinions and cultural positions in Afghanistan, so I'm having to generalise, but there would more broadly than in a Taliban supporting sense be people who have those same kind of cultural views, that women have these very defined, restricted roles. I was reading Brett Sutton, the Chief Health Officer, had written a report when he was being a medic in Afghanistan in 2003, I think it was. So, when the Taliban were as much on the outer as they've ever been, and talking about this experience of being a medic in remote clinics and treating women who needed better treatment than he could provide, who needed to go to a hospital in a town that was a day or two's travel away, and how they wouldn't be able to get there because they would have to be accompanied by their husbands, and they couldn't have both parents leave the children behind or leave a farm behind or whatever it was. And so there were women not getting essential medical care because they were not allowed to travel to the hospital by themselves. That was just unacceptable. That was not even taken into consideration that it could happen that way. So you are dealing with a broader cultural understanding that women are not supposed to do these things. Now, that's something that obviously to you and me seems absurd and seems outdated, but it is the reality of the way of life for a lot of people in that country. So for that to change over a period of time was going to need to be gradual. And I've seen a lot of people talking about the cricket, saying that the ICC had already given the Afghanistan board a pass because they didn't have a women's team for the last 10 years and they were supposed to. But they were working on that. They were gradually trying to make that change. And I think that is one massive difference, that up until a few months ago, there was the potential, there was the possibility for an Afghanistan women's team. Right now, with the Taliban in control, there is no possibility of that. It is not going to happen. It will not happen. And so I think that's a really important distinction to make when you're looking at the ICC backing the Afghanistan Cricket Board before versus whether it can continue to back that board now.
Yeah, that was a strong line last week, wasn't it? That CA are happy to effectively shun Afghanistan now, but they were happy to acquiesce and allow them membership as an associate member. And again, as a full member, remember that they went from associate in, I think it's 2002, to full member in 2017 when they became a test playing nation. And that this could have been considered then in a more fulsome way. But yeah, as you say, Jeff, it didn't, even though there wasn't an Afghanistan women's team, it certainly felt like there was a roadmap towards one. Whether that was being prettied up in such a way that, to satisfy people like you and me.
Window dressing or...
Hard for us
not.
to know.
Yeah.
Really, really hard for us to know. But again, sort of based on the conversation we had a couple of weeks ago with Shadi, he's been covering this story for not just 2 months, but for sort of a number of years. And his attitude towards it, his positive attitude towards there being real meaningful change towards the women in Afghanistan having a chance to play, being inspired by watching the men on their journey. I mean, it's exactly the same as what we hear with Ireland, for example, who they became full members with back in 17. You hear about the Irish women's journey being kind of the men's journey, but sort of 15 years ago. And that's nice. I like the idea that one follows the next, that one piece of successes has enabled another. But yeah, the fact that won't happen now is galling. I'm not sure there is a right answer here, by the way. The ICC, I mentioned like maybe the domino effect of Australia saying no. That might be the catalyst for the ICC saying no. I'm a little bit surprised the ICC haven't been more on the front foot about this and haven't been a bit more forthright in their view. One way or the other, mindful that there's a World Cup coming up in, I think Afghanistan, as being part of the main group, won't play for another 6 weeks. But still, that requires travelling to UAE, going through their own quarantine process. If they have to replace them in the tournament, that's a massive deal. Huge deal.
It almost feels
huge global
like,
story.
It almost feels like hands over the ears. Like, let's just hope we can get through this World Cup and then we'll worry about it afterwards. Like, it's too soon to do anything about it now.
Yeah, look, and that may well be what happens. That they, fingers in the ears for the next couple of months, get through the World Cup and deal with it then. But yeah, this will all come to a head when Australia formally cancel this Test match, which seems like a formality now, on the basis that we've had this comment from the Taliban spokesman last week, and surely that isn't sort of a rogue comment. That's thoroughly in keeping with what we.
I can't imagine he's getting a call from the other blokes, running the joint,
no,
saying,
actually,
tone it down, buddy.
Actually, down a few notches. Put out a retraction, please, champion. No, that's not what's going on here. So.
So I guess
I'm not sure I'm not sure if there is a, like with a lot of things in public life, there isn't a right and wrong answer. There's simply a number of shit answers, a number of bad outcomes, and you just have to pick the least worst. I think that this is where we're steering towards here. No matter which way administrators go, it is going to be a bad result. It's just which bad result they go for.
And here's what I've been trying to work out is fundamentally you're looking at what option is going to help or hurt the Taliban and what option is going to help or hurt other people in Afghanistan. So talking about that South Africa comparison, because a lot of people have said, look, it's a very morally clear question. We did it with South Africa. You can't support a discriminatory government with violent tendencies, which would probably rule out about, 95% of the world's governments if you held that line. But the South Africa comparison doesn't work because, as you said, South Africa wanted to be part of a bigger club of nations. They wanted to be on the inside, and they were.
Well, they were on the inside. The crucial point is they were part of the big kids club, right?
Right, and the Talib, like their whole thing has been isolationist historically. They've been about building an Islamic caliphate on their own interpretation of things, which is, doesn't follow the doctrine where it's more convenient for them. And that kind of suits them all right to be left alone. There is some room for leverage with aid money and things like that. But look, they'll probably get financial and military assistance from China, and they'll probably get it from Russia because the governments in those two places do not give a shit about the morals or ethics of the governments that they're supporting. So in a lot of ways, they think, well, who cares if people in Western countries are getting annoyed about this? It doesn't matter. They'll be able to get that other backing pretty easily. So it doesn't. You can cancel matches against Afghanistan. It's not going to hurt the Taliban particularly. But then I suppose the other side of that question is, if you let that Afghanistan team play, does it help the Taliban? Because it will give them legitimacy. It will let spokesmen from their government be able to show up to events and come in and shake hands and be treated as legitimate national leaders, just like anybody else who shows up. It shows Afghanistan to the world in a normalised sort of way to say, oh, look, everything's fine. Their team's at the World Cup, all is good, right? So is that enough? Is helping a reprehensible government in that way enough of a reason to say don't do it? Or is the other side of that again more important, to say that Afghanistan as a country, rather than the Taliban as a ruling sect, if Afghanistan as a country has an increased presence in the world, that offers the possibility of increasing pressure on the Taliban because that Afghanistan is more visible. There's more engagement with Afghanistan. If there are male Afghan athletes competing in Olympic Games, for instance, and there are no women there, it's going to be extremely obvious that that's the case. Does having more of a presence in the world allow for more possibility to set examples for people in Afghanistan to say, here are things that you could be aspiring to, here are ways to try to increase pressure on the government from within, and ways to increase pressure on that Taliban government from without? There are so many different ways to look at it, and I don't have any sort of answer for it.
Yeah, I suppose what you end up doing is reaching around for historical precedent. So you've already detailed why South Africa is a tough one, but I suppose you look at other countries where there have been considerable sanctions, economic sanctions, and beyond. I mean, Iran, Iraq at different times. Has it worked? I mean, I'm probably not fit to judge that question, but other countries that have been isolated by the world at large, has it been more effective shutting out countries, or has it been more effective letting them have a seat at the table and trying to steer their behaviour? Is it possible to steer the behaviour of the Taliban? Probably not, because sort of Wahhabist extremists who see the world in such a way, can that change in the space of Rashid Khan's leg spinning career? Probably not. To be really blunt about it in terms of what this actually means for these young cricketers who've done such a proud job for their country in the last 10 years. So again, it comes back to this idea of is there a roadmap forward? Is there a way forward where Afghanistan can play without it lending legitimacy to the people that run the show from the Taliban? Probably not. Is that a price that we are willing to pay as a cricketing community in order to not damage both men and women who play the game in that country? I mean, it's an impossible choice. Yeah. But it's one that has to be arrived at, and hopefully in this dispassionate way. And I hope this conversation is viewed in those terms. This isn't about hot takes. It isn't about sort of being overly strident, I don't think. It's about trying to acknowledge that there is loads of grey area here, and well-meaning people trying to arrive at an outcome that's suitable. I think CA have endeavoured to be part of that. But yeah, it's yet to be seen whether it'll be effective or not.